Hi, everybody. Can I ask Kelley Beaucar to come to the table? Kelley? My name is Khaled Elgindy. I'm the president of National Interest Foundation. Thank you all for being here with us. And we have a very good panel today. Someone protested that it's all Palestinian. We tried to, Khaled is Egyptian originally. We tried to invite several Jewish Americans to come and speak, and their schedule didn't work out, so we were out of town. None of them was sick. But anyway, we will have a good discussion about this issue, and also we will have a Palestinian point of view or perspective on this plan, since it concerns them, and most people didn't hear this point of view. Kelley will be moderating the panel. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll turn to Q&A. So please be short with your questions, right to the point, and no lectures, so you allow others to speak. Thank you again.
I think it's on. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think by the presence of everybody here, the crowded atmosphere, we know how indication of how important this issue is today, especially today. And I'm really happy to see all the faces, familiar faces, and welcome. Sure. How's this? Oh, good. Okay. Fantastic. My name is Kelley Beaucar. I'm an executive editor with the American Conservative Magazine, and I'm very honored to be asked to moderate this wonderful panel with these esteemed speakers. I think we know why we're here, the perspective on the Trump Middle East peace plan. I know that there's been some headlines breaking about this very recently. Mahmoud Abbas was in New York yesterday, and he described the plan as illegitimate, one-sided proposal that rewarded Israel for decades of occupation and turned his people's land into Swiss cheese, riddled with Israeli settlements. And I think that's a very graphic description of the plan, and it captures some of the sentiment among the Palestinians and in the Arab world today. And we have some experts here who can speak more about how that plan is being, what the reaction to that plan is at this moment. So to my left, forgive me for reading off of notes here, Said Arikat is a longtime Washington-based Palestinian journalist and analyst. He's an accomplished media and public affairs specialist who served for a number of years as the United Nations chief spokesman in Iraq. He holds a master's from California State University in Long Beach and is an adjunct professor at the American University in Washington, where he teaches courses on the role of media in society. and regularly appears on various media outlets. One voice. With both domestically and internationally, in international media outlets. So welcome to you. Thank you so much for being here with us. To my immediate right is Khaled Elgindy, who is a,
No.
to my immediate far
All
right. Perspectives. He is a senior fellow at the Mideast Institute, where he also directs MEI's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He is the author of the newly released book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, published by Brookings Institute Press, in April, coming out in April, or came out in April 2019. Previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings Institution from 2010 through 2018. Prior to arriving at Brookings, he served as an advisor to Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2019, 2009, and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations in 2007. Elgindy is also an adjunct instructor in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And then to my immediate right, a man who's known to most people, I'm sure, in this room, Dr. Shibley Telhami, is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development and Director of Critical Issues Pole at the University of Maryland. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Before coming to the University of Maryland, he taught at several universities, including Cornell, Ohio State University, University of Southern California, Princeton, Columbia, Swarthmore, and the University of California, Berkeley, where he received his doctorate in political science. He has also been active in the foreign policy arena, advising every U.S. administration from George H.W. Bush to Barack Obama. He has contributed to the Washington Post, New York Times, and regularly appears on national and international radio and television. And among his publications are his best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, which was published in 2003, Power and Leadership in International Bargaining, The Path to Camp David Accords, Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, which he co-authored with Dan Kurtzer, and The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East. Thank you all for coming today to lend some perspective on the issues. Would you each like to maybe make a broad statement about your reactions to Trump's Middle East peace plan, and then maybe we can drill down on some specific questions? Would that be? Okay. Would you like to go first?
I'm happy to go first. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. I just closer. Does this work? I'm not sure. I see. Is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm really happy to be here. I just actually flew back yesterday from Jordan, and you can imagine the kind of concern that is now being aired in Jordan about the consequences of this plan. Let me just put a couple of things out, in terms of my quick reaction. As has been pointed out, I have advised every single administration from Bush 41 until Obama, Republican and Democrat, and including ones I disagreed with. So it's not unusual in American politics to have, kind of differences and different focus on the issue. But this obviously is nothing short of a revolution, and I don't mean all revolutions are good, that we have seen. Because what's really concerning about this plan is far more than just the terms of the plan. The terms of the plan are troubling enough because they wouldn't work. And I think ultimately they're certainly not good for the Palestinians, but they're not good ultimately, I think, personally for the Israelis, and certainly they're not good for the U.S. in terms of bringing about stability in the region. the terms in particular that are concerning, this is not, of course, an offer for a Palestinian state. The term state is used for sure, but when you read it, there is no question that what is being offered is not a state with sovereignty. You are talking about fragmented territories that include roughly 60% of the West Bank, with no control over air, over water, over borders, over security, over alliances. I mean, there is no characteristic of a state, obviously. So that's a joke. It's a joke to call it a state, really. It's not about even, the Swiss cheese analogy that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas employed, because that suggests that the really state is just fragmented. No, it's not even a state. I mean, that's not what's being offered. And second, obviously, when you look at a disturbing part of the plan, which calls for transfer of Arab villages that are now in Israel with nearly a quarter million Israeli citizens who are being represented in the Israeli Knesset, who would be then transferred under Palestinian control, and where there's no less than sovereignty anyway. And by the way, they reject it, because all the polls, including ones that I have conducted among Palestinian citizens of Israel, they don't want, they support the Palestinian state. They want equality, they want Palestinian freedom, but they don't want to be transferred under Palestinian authority. And so this would be against their will. It's really extraordinary to think that there would be an American plan, leader of the free world, proposing the transfer of territories with populations to another state, mainly because of their ethnicity. I mean, that is just something that's mind-boggling. It's not the America we have known. And that's why I said there's a revolution here. It's not about, Republican and Democrat. It's really about something profoundly different, profoundly troubling, profoundly at odds with what America stands for. That's just in terms of the plan itself. But I think it goes beyond that, because I think the principles that are proposed to anchor the plan are highly problematic. The first principle is, quote, to ignore history. Okay, now at some point, people have to get over history. Obviously, you incorporate it, and when you reach a conclusion, you end a chapter and you start a new one for sure. Well, what is being proposed here is something extraordinarily different, because by history, what is referred to here is also international law and international resolutions. So what you're talking about when you're saying to the Palestinians, ignore the fact that the settlements were built against international law. Ignore the fact that they're still considered to be illegal under international law. Just accept them, because now they are a reality. It is really troubling for far beyond the Israeli-Palestinian question. It's troubling for international politics. It's troubling. Imagine telling Ukraine over the Russians occupying territory, just accept it. This is the way it is. The sort of signal that sends across the international community and across the Middle East, if this principle is to be upheld, it is really something that is mind-boggling, unprecedented in American foreign policy, and with far-reaching consequences that I think cannot be ignored. In addition to that, I think when you consider the fact that this asymmetry of power that exists, that the Trump administration wants to start with, is an asymmetry that is in large part due to American policy. Remember that Israel is powerful today, and you have to give Israel also a lot of credit in terms of its ability to build its power over time. They've been very successful in building themselves as a powerful state. Put aside the politics for them, but they have organized themselves effectively, and they have been a very successful state in terms of its projection of power globally, far beyond the size of the state. But don't underestimate the extent to which American policy is highly responsible for that. Three things in particular: the fact that the U.S. has shielded Israel in the UN by veto, by the use of veto or the threat of veto to shield Israel from the consequences of violation of international law, such as on settlements. The fact that the U.S. has provided Israel with cutting-edge technology that gives Israel the technological edge militarily over any combination of Arab forces, period. And so those are the sort of things, obviously, where the U.S. itself has been a part of the responsibility of this asymmetry. And instead of taking some responsibility for the asymmetry, which was done in the name of a secure Israel, is able to present more compromises, the Trump team wants to exacerbate, not only legitimize this asymmetry, but also exacerbate it and bestowing sovereignty over territories that's not its own on Israel. To say unilaterally as an American power, I propose that we give sovereign settlements something that is really extraordinary. Again, not certainly what we see in contemporary international relations. One of the things that is also troubling is that when we say that the history should be ignored, and of course history should not be ignored, I mean, whether it's Jewish history, Arab history, Palestinian history, everybody's history is important and it has to be taken into account. But put that broad principle aside, because this plan doesn't even ignore all history, because it's actually based on the justification, legitimation, the statement, architecture of the plan. They are referring often to a biblical narrative of history as legitimizing sovereignty. So it's not, all history is not being ignored. Actually, the only history that's not being ignored is a biblical narrative of history. And when you consider that, I think it's troubling. It's troubling not because religious history is not important. It's important. Religious faith is important. Religious narrative is important. Whether it's for Jews, Muslims, Christians, that's something we all have to take into account. Everybody should care about it. It is important for the conflict. I don't ignore it. I respect faith. I respect that people have different worldviews. The problem is when you use someone's religious narrative as a basis for political sovereignty over in the 21st century. That's not only wrong, it is dangerous. It is dangerous because it basically frames the conflict in religious terms. And it plants the seeds of zero-sum game along religious lines for years to come. One of the promises of the 1990s with the Oslo agreements, troubling as they were, the reason why we had hope is that the conflict was framed in national terms that lends itself to compromise. If we encode religion as the basis of political sovereignty now, we are opening a whole new bag of trouble ahead, and there is no hope ahead. So I think here, it isn't just the plan that's troubling, it is the very principles that underpin the plan that are troubling.
Thank you very much. Said?
Thank you. Thank you, Kelley, and my colleagues and everybody, all my friends here. But, you know, when I walked in, I spoke with Aziz Bati, and I asked him, he asked me, how are you doing? And I said, not so well. And he said, how come? I said, yeah, because of the situation. And he said, yes, it aches my heart. True, it aches my heart, what I say. And he also said, the situation is so pathetic of the Arabs. And I think, then I spoke with Saba, and Saba said, unlike other analysts in town, I love this century. Of course, I was taken aback. He said, no, because it really just, it reveals, it takes that big leap on who our enemies are. It defines, sorry. It clearly defines our enemies, who for the Palestinians and who stands against them. And all these things are true. And of course, a great deal has been said about this deal of the century. But really, for me, there's nothing new in it. Definitely since since this, sorry about that. This is symbolic of our situation, very precarious. So, ever since, at least since Donald Trump came to the White House, and we have been writing about this. I remember I was at the Republican convention in 2016, and the same cast of characters were trying to work out the platform. David Friedman, Jason Greenblatt, Kushner, all there in Cleveland, and they were trying to work out and adding to the platform that Israel has the right to build whatever area it controls. So since day one, this has been the case. I was really surprised at the enthusiasm of the Palestinians with the new administration. I remember that my good friend, the PLO ambassador in town, Hassan Zumba, and he thought that this administration really thinks out of the box. This administration is different. He was enthused, and then I met with Said Arikat, disclosure with a cousin of mine, and I saw them and they were enthused. They were meeting. These guys really serious. They want to resolve this issue. They're coming. In fact, they were coming to conclude this thing. In many ways, what they have done is just a culmination of what has preceded them. There's nothing new. The U.S. has always protected settlement. It has always protected Israeli aggression. It has always, president after president after president, secretary of state after secretary of state after secretary of state. I remember I've been going to the State Department briefing room for 4 decades, and they have always said the same thing. Israel was hammering, killing civilians, bombing civilians, destroying schools in Gaza in 2014, in 2012, and so on. And the same statement would come out again and again and again, that Israel has a right to defend itself. It kills children, but it has a right to defend itself. And then, almost all of them, everybody, including the PA, they have all worked together to delegitimize any kind of Palestinian resistance to the occupation. So this is really a long history. I remember writing in March 2017 about the plan that was basically the same plan that was, released, and saying that they're going to make my village Mideast, I'm from Mideast, which is right on this side of the wall there, and possibly, open gates on Fridays, and then come back. They can't even shop in the whole city, let alone claim it as a state. It talked about, maintaining control over the Jordan Valley. It talked about keeping all the settlement plots and so on. And it talked about not allowing any refugee ever to return. And it talked about, just being thrown about, which really was good stuff by the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy and Chance and others, that the Palestinians are only 30,000 refugees. The rest are descendants of refugees, but that's what remains and so on. So all these ideas were there. And and for the life of me, I can't figure out why this Palestinian negotiating team, whether it's Arikat or Hassan or it's others and so on, that went in and met with these people time after time and so on at the White House, never really raised these issues. Are you for this or not for this? It's very clearly, when you say I want a state, and I don't want to go back to history because there's so much, and I'm sorry, but this is an issue that is redundant. We have to repeat all these things because it is so damn repetitive. It has always been the case. So when even in Oslo, when you talk about a state, you say that I am not willing to give 1 inch more of the 78% of Palestine that I've given. That's it. That you have by international resolution on the issue of refugees. Jerusalem is capital. Some things are very simple. What you say, but don't talk to people. When you build as the PA did, when you build your parliament in Mideast, And people say, you've agreed to that to begin with, right? I mean, that's what they did back in 94, 95, 96, and so on. So there's a record of U.S. Repression or aiding the repression of the Palestinians, but also there's a record of ineptitude by the Palestinians. You can look at it, and it was really, sadly enough, it was highlighted yesterday. I mean, there was the Palestinian president, kept departing from apparently a prepared text, kept going back that, we are against terrorism and we are against violence, and I promise you this, that there will be no violence and so on. There will be no. So, in other words, he's still saying the same narrative that continues to delegitimize Palestinian resistance to a horrible occupation. The most brutal violence and terrorism is the one practiced by the Israeli army daily, every day. Today they just released, a couple of sub-settlers who have, marauding settlers who killed the Palestinians because, they were under pressure from right-wing groups and so on. So, I mean, you look at Abbas, and then he's really destabilized. And, I also want to talk about the 2 days that preceded his speech and so on. And then he goes and he meets with Ulmer, if there's any discredit in Israelis, probably Ulmer, is very discredited. He's been to prison, he's been, he was accused of corruption and so on. And then, he brings them with him to a press conference. And Abbas, says, my friend, and all these things, we almost arrived at, and then Ulmer says, yeah, but the deal of the century is actually good. So he basically supported the deal of the century. And then, Arafat takes his entourage and then leaves, and Ulmer stays there answering questions and so on. So instead of taking advantage of this forum, this, a worldly forum, they failed even to do that, the Palestinians, It's not all, not everything Palestinian that is bad, but we must, emphasize these things, because I don't see things improving until we really change, until the narratives change, until the substance of the right of people to resist occupation or any repression, is back priority number one for the Palestinians and for whoever leads the Palestinians. But if you look at the 2 days before Abbas's speech yesterday at the UN, and I'm sorry, there are so much information, but I do want to talk about it. They spent the last 4 or 5 days trying to draft or craft together some sort of a draft resolution to put before the Security Council so they can vote on it. First, they talked to the Tunisian ambassador, who is the Arab group have 1 member on the Security Council. There are 5 permanent members, and I think 11 10, yes, they're all 15, sorry, and 10 non-permanent. So they talked to him, and he apparently, worked with Riyad Mansour on some sort of a draft that, basically says, like they did with Jerusalem, in 2017, that this is, that must be, not adopted, that we must take a position against it. We, by no means, we will, the world adheres to its previous commitment to the resolutions, to 2334 resolution in 2016 and so on. But suddenly, the Americans who were vicious and their bullying and their pressure the Tunisian government, the Tunisian government recalled its ambassador, he was fired on the spot, and they failed to muster enough support. Although the support is there, because the European Union, when you talk about countries like Estonia, Belgium, France, and Germany, they are committed to the 2-state solution on 67 borders with Jerusalem capital. And in fact, even the British, who, Boris Johnson said that the Trump plan is not so bad, we can take a look at it, but you could have, and then you have the other members, Vietnam, South Africa, and Indonesia, and Tunisia. Those are, these should have been with you. So my point is, there's an element of ineptness that has, plagued this PA, for the past, at least for the past 3 years, in terms of being able to function and marshal support. Quite the contrary. The Palestinian cause is losing support among Arabs, or at least among Arab governments. We saw a member of the council from Sudan, the governing council, go and meet with Netanyahu. Others are saying, look, everybody agrees to this deal, and behind closed doors and so on, and they issue these statements in public. I think we have to feel what is going on. We have to feel what the Israelis are doing. And I fear that this can go on for a very, very long time. I mean, if you look at, maybe example in history and so on, you say, what we have today is a one-state solution, and ultimately it will be an apartheid situation and so on. Yes, it can, and it can go on, because it does have support from the mightiest power in history, the United States of America, and also the Europeans. We have not seen them do much. The point is that, they can say, this is yours. You want it, take it. You don't want it, we will just practice, we will conduct ourselves as if, you have agreed to it, whether you like it or not. What you need to do, there are steps that the Palestinians can do and can take immediately to really turn things around and to make, to expose the Israelis for what they are, to expose the Israel as an apartheid country, a racist country that continues to practice, ethnic cleansing, maybe not on a large scale, continues to practice repression of Palestinians in villages and towns all across the West Bank, and even move Israeli Arabs and so on. You can say this without fearing any confusion. They want to move the population of the triangle and have it as part of the state. All this can be undone by the Palestinians, because in reality, the Palestinian people really have the only veto that counts. They have the veto that counts. The Palestinians are strong, they are powerful, but they need to sort of organize their priorities. They need to end the silly divisions, the stupid divisions between Hamas and Fatah and so on, between Gaza and the West Bank. What are they fighting for? That's one. Second, for the PA to really be viable and to claim representation of the Palestinians, it has to end all these, horrible, shameful coordination agreements and so on with the Israeli occupation. Top among them is the security coordination. This must end, because that security coordination has worked only for one thing, and that is to prevent Palestinians from fighting back or resisting the occupation. Remember, the word resistance is just that. It means pushing back. People don't resist because that one day says, "Oh, resistance is really good." No, they resist because they face this horrible situation day in and day out. So these are the things that they ought to do. If they don't want to sort of shut out the light, lock the door, and throw the key back to the occupation, they can do something short of that. They can declare a state under occupation. That can be done, And the Palestinians are not going to go anywhere. They're not. Before the PA, the Palestinians were there, where they were able to, organize an intifada and so on. I don't want to talk, but I'm saying that we do have a great deal of options that can refocus the world attention on the Palestinian issue, and I think you can garner support. Remember, the support will be sort of commensurate with the element of your ability to resist and to fight back this horrible occupation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Said. Khaled?
Thank you. I'm going to try not to be too repetitive and to also be as quick as I can. So as we've already heard, this is not a peace plan in any sense that we typically understand that term. But it is actually a means of formalizing Israeli annexation and the permanent Bantustanization of Palestine. The question now, and we see this in the public debate happening between Israeli and American officials over annexation. It's really a question of timing. It's not about if, but when. Will it be before March, after March? How much, exactly when after the Israeli election this is supposed to happen? But annexation, I believe, is almost certainly coming, particularly if the next Israeli election is more decisive in terms of Netanyahu coming out on top. And as we heard already, the plan does not call for a Palestinian state. I mean, I sort of liken the plan to something like malware. When you get something pop up on your computer and says, click here, and you'll get all these goodies, some great software or maybe even money. But of course, it's a gimmick that is designed to hijack your computer and essentially to crash it. And so they use these terms: two-state solution, Palestinian state. They talk about a capital and Eastern Jerusalem sort of in the same sentence, and they're supposed to say, "Wow, this is impressive for Trump." But the reality, of course, is that once you click on it, it crashes the system. And I think I think people can't be ambiguous about this plan. It's not a basis for future negotiations. It is the end of future negotiations. It's not a basis for a Palestinian state. It is the end of the idea of a two-state solution. So I think that much is clear, at least to a number of many people here in Washington. As we also heard, it's full of contradictions. We hear Greenblatt and Friedman and others saying we can't dwell on history. The plan has that kind of language. We should not dwell on history, but of course it indulges one version of history quite extensively. The plan talks about international law is not really relevant, and yet it also makes the claim that the settlements are not illegal. So is it that does the law matter or not matter? And so it's riddled with those kinds of contradictions. But it's not a plan that I think we can ignore for as much of a farce as it is. As I see it, the plan is premised on three interconnected goals. I think this is what the plan is actually trying to achieve. The first is to take Palestinian statehood and other national aspirations off the table. So no sovereign Palestinian state. Instead, you will have these fragmented cantons and Bantustans that are connected through a network of roads and tunnels, but are all of which are completely surrounded by and completely under Israeli control and domination. So sovereignty is off the table. We know that Jerusalem's off the table because Trump told us that even before the plan was published. And they, as we also heard, are trying to eliminate the entire issue of Palestinian refugees. So that's one goal. The other goal, I think, that is just as important is to delegitimize the Palestinian political leadership. Obviously, they were excluded from this plan. I think there is a sense that Palestinian acceptance would be nice, but it's certainly not necessary. We've heard this repeatedly from Israeli officials explicitly, if not from the Trump administration. They would like Palestinian acquiescence in the plan, but it is going to move forward with or without it. And so it's not just a denial of Palestinian self-determination, but even a negation of Palestinian agency. Palestinians don't matter in terms of being able to play a role in defining their own future. And so in that sense, we've gone back to not just the pre-Oslo period, but we've gone back to the pre-1967 period in a lot of ways when we didn't even need to consider Palestinian agency. The third goal, and the one that I think is the most likely to succeed, is in terms of negating the internationally accepted terms of reference, especially UN Security Council Resolution 242 and the Land for Peace formula, which has been the basis of US policy for more than 50 years, but also other international norms. And that is, I think, perfectly in keeping with the Trump administration's worldview, which is really a full frontal assault on the rules-based international order itself. They are very much in the worldview of might makes right. International law doesn't matter. International norms don't matter. Only the powerful need to succeed. And so there's a real threat there, I think, in terms of those in the international community, especially the European Union or the United Nations, who value a rules-based international order. More specifically, I think, because of all of these, I think the plan poses an existential threat to the Palestinian national project. It's not the only existential threat, certainly, but it is, when it comes from a combined American-Israeli effort, one that you have to take seriously. Sadly, I think Palestinians have their own self-made existential threats, the internal division. Their political institutions are in a state of total disarray, whether you're talking about the PLO or the PA. They're both in decline and stagnation. The plan, I think, also poses, as I said, a mortal threat to a two-state solution. I think it's very important, to the extent that people still believe a two-state solution is possible, and I'm not at all convinced that it is, but it is at least theoretically possible. It's very important to think about how to counter this plan by those who value that goal. In terms of, as we look forward, I think with that in mind, it's important to remember how we got here. Trump didn't emerge in a vacuum. The previous administrations, I think to a very large extent, paved the way for Trump to be able to do what he did. Since the administration of Bill Clinton, there's been a steady erosion of these international terms of reference that the peace process was based on 242. We would see things like the United States doesn't like settlement activity, but then, sort of agree separately with the Israelis, go ahead and build in these areas, carving out various loopholes and exceptions for the Israelis. And in many cases, putting their thumb on the scale. We remember the George W. Bush letter of assurances, in which he tried to assure the Israelis that Israeli settlement blocks would remain, that the refugee issue would only be resolved in the context of a future Palestinian state. And so there are precedents for the kinds of things that Trump is doing. And even in terms of delegitimizing the Palestinian national leadership, we all remember the no partner narrative that took hold in 2000 and since then. That's not to say that Trump is not different. I think he is different, but it's a question of degree. I think he's taken those opportunities created by previous administrations and has capitalized them in a way that in essence, the enemies of a two-state solution have been much more focused and determined in their ability to thwart it than the champions of a two-state solution have been. The level of commitment, I think, between the two camps has been very, very different. And so I'm saying that not necessarily as an indictment of previous administrations, but as we look forward, if there is any chance of saving a two-state solution, it will not be possible, in my view, to simply go back to the status quo ante. In other words, we can't simply go, turn the clock back to 2016 before Trump did any of these terrible things. But actually, we need to adopt a very, very different approach that centers Palestinian rights and that centers the international norms in a much more focused way than anything that we have seen in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a ton of questions. Khaled, how much time do we have for questions and then Q&A with the audience?
I think we have 25 minutes. I have
Altogether?
to run at 2:15, but I think Said and Khaled can stay a few minutes more.
I pushed my meeting a little, so I'll stay.
Okay,
till
we're at
2:30.
30 minutes, yeah.
Okay, 25 minutes altogether.
30 minutes, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to start with you, Shibley. We talked about, your extensive background of working with presidential administrations through the years on this particular issue. How much damage has the Trump administration done to the peace process. And as a sidebar question, the prospect of another 4 years of President Trump, which is very likely, how much more damage can he do? What do you see in the future if he has 4 more years to continue this symmetric relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, who may or may not, be ousted in the next election? So what do you see for the future?
Yeah, let me just start with, those are really two separate questions. So the first one, in terms of previous administration. I think it's very important, first of all, I don't use the term peace process because that has been, I'm not sure what that is, but peacemaking or diplomatic attempts to address this issue. I think if you look at what Khaled ended up doing, which I think is a very important point, is that it's not like the previous administrations have succeeded. I mean, one of the reasons why people were somewhat open to Trump initially were the Palestinians saying, well, I've got something new. And of course, he sent different mixed signals early on. Was the fact is everybody had failed. And frankly, including the Obama administration, which I had also advised on this issue, which not only failed, but in some ways set the process back, in my opinion, by essentially, wasting 8 years. It didn't advance the process, and time was not on the side of the solution. So in that sense, let's be, truthful. While there were people have, in principle, wanted, quote, the right thing or 2 states, that's not, and I think Obama did. Obama genuinely wanted to see 2 states. So why have there been failure prior to Trump? And I happen to think that principally, as a student of international relations and foreign policy, principally, because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not been a priority issue for America strategically since the end of the Cold War. And that meant that even presidents who really want to address it just didn't want to put in the kind of energy that is required, given the politics, because domestically, the American political system is stacked in favor of Israel. And so therefore, any president who wants to go against that structure or work with it or persuade it or has to invest so much of his or her energy to move it forward, and it has to be a strategic priority. It has not. And let me give you an example with the Obama administration. The Obama administration worked hard in some ways, right? But the president never made a decision to pay a political price or to move Congress or to invest time to persuade Congress in the same way that he did with the Iran nuclear deal. Remember, the Iran nuclear deal was not popular in Congress. He faced a Republican because it was not popular in Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel called it an existential threat. An existential threat. He came and spoke to a joint session of Parliament. But the President of the United States, for whatever reason, believed this was strategically important for the United States. And as a priority issue, he worked and passed and made it happen, despite all of the odds against him. He did not feel the same way on Israel and Palestine. I don't think he's been a president who felt that way. And so, in a way, that's part of the problem. So, however, in theory, people kept the 2-state solution open as theoretical, as Khaled used the term theoretical, despite the fact that its odds were declining. And their odds were declining, as I said, because time was not on its side. Expansion of settlements, the rise of right-wing Israel, and so forth. So I think it's a problem that we've had, and therefore you can't go back to square one, because let's assume that the Democrats win the presidency. I think they will not accept the plan. Some parts of the plan will impose themselves. There's some realities that are going to be very hard to overturn, but they will not implement the plan or support implementation of the plan, or might take a different position if they win. But you can't go back to square one. That's just not, that isn't a possibility, because even before Trump, that didn't work. With regard to Trump and Netanyahu, will there be something different? I mean, if you look at this as a plan that is really in support of Israeli unilateral implementation, which is what it is, I think, yes, there will be more time for implementation of the plan. And I think that there's no question in my mind that an empowered Trump, as we see, is going to also empower those who led the plan. I will say one thing though, and it's really important to, particularly now that I came back from Jordan, as you can imagine, the Jordanians are worried. It's not just about implementation of the plan for the Israel, for the Palestinians of West Bank and Gaza. It's what are the regional consequences, and whether or not the idea, quote, of Jordan is Palestine that had preceded, that had been hot in the discourse prior to the Jordanian Israeli peace treaty 25 years ago, is now back on the table in the discourse, particularly in Israel as tension emerges between Israel and Palestinians. Because no matter what happens, even if the Palestinians are weak and they may not have ways of addressing this issue, they're going to resist. This is not going to be something they'll accept. Nobody is going to accept, being essentially under permanent occupation. It's just not going to happen. So there is going to be a confrontational process that is going to have consequences for the region, and that is precisely why I think everybody is concerned.
Let's talk a little bit about the regional consequences. Said, what was the reaction in the Arab world when this peace plan or this plan was announced? I know there were a lot of headlines, talking about this is going to set the Arab world on fire. It's going to, complete uncertainty and destabilization of the region. First of all, what was the reaction from other Arab states? And second of all, is there room for hope that the Arab states, any in particular, might be able to put some pressure on the Trump administration? Because that seems key here. When Trump seems to be, when people and organizations or lobbies get to Trump, really get his ear, sometimes he does listen. Is there room there to pressure him enough to maybe draw back a little bit on the implementation of the plan moving forward? Because right now it looks like a big green light that he's given to Netanyahu, but is there any areas where that green light might turn yellow at some point?
Well, let me begin with your last point. I don't think there's any Arab country that can, even if it is willing to, even if it contemplates to pressure the Trump administration. No Arab country can do that. When we talk about the Arab world today, we talk about the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on. And you find that the Gulf and Saudi Arabia and all these things, they have their security mortgage to the U.S., the protection of the U.S. And the U.S., exercises a great deal of influence. So, that's why the confusion was, over the past, not only over the past 3 weeks since the announcement of the plan, but even in the interim, the back and forth and saying that, they supported, they held this Bahrain conference back in June 25, June 26, that was supposed to be the economic part or the economic side of the deal of the century and so on. And they were giving signals that they agreed to it. And then, when it was announced while 3 Arab ambassadors were there. They were present. The pictures are all over the place. Then there was a meeting, between Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and the newborn story. He met with ambassadors, including Arab ambassadors, and basically he just lashed out at the PA, called the Palestinian president all kinds of names, and they all came out of there saying, look, we are basically they're in agreement. And that was just right the following day, I think, after the announcement on the 29th of last month. Then, we had the meeting in Cairo, the following Saturday, I think it was the first of the month. And the Arab League said that they're opposed to the plan. They only adhere to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 and so on that calls for an independent Palestinian state with, fully sovereign, contiguous, and all these things, So we have the stated positions and the actual positions. I don't see that these Arab governments will do anything really to stop Trump. They will continue to pay lip service to the Palestinian cause. The Palestinians are dependent on aid from them, especially after the American aid was cut. And they see, obviously, as we've seen with Sudan, last week, the reason Burhan went and met with Netanyahu is because Pompeo called him, and I know this, and he called him and he said, look, if you do this, we will take you off the terror list. We'll take Sudan off the terror list. So this administration is willing to exercise blackmail in the ugliest of ways, and it will use it with the Arab. They use it at the UN. They use it with their allies, with Belgium. They use it with France, and so on. So it will not hesitate. I think there are also, in my opinion, my modest opinion, the thorniest issues of all time is the Iranian nuclear issue. It is a non-existent. We know that. The Iranians have given up all they had back in 2003. Read report after report by all the intelligence agencies. In 2007, it was published, and in many other, including the CIA, saying that Iran does not have any ambition for nuclear, weaponized nuclear program. But it is a great cover. It's a great smoke screen for Israel to continue stealing the land in the West Bank. Nobody pays attention. They are saying, look at this boogeyman, Iran, and so on. So all these things must come together. Now, I think that the Arab people genuinely support the justice of the Palestinian cause. I believe that. And I think that if you have a survey today, if you ask all Arabs all across, you will find a great deal of support, and they're willing to do a great deal more to support the Palestinians. It is the Palestinians that must give the Arabs the hope they need in terms of, well, for one thing, that this deal of the century, it really put the last nail in the coffin in the two-state solution. It was a non-starter to begin with, but now it's over. It is over for the Palestinians. So what they need to do is craft a strategy so they can resist this occupation, garner the support of the Arabs, and garner the support of the world. I mean, look what is happening in America. I mean, today, the Palestinian cause finds a great deal of sympathy on college campuses, among different groups, among the base of the Democratic Party. So, on the one hand, you have support, and Israel is being exposed to what it is, but on the other, the Palestinians must do things so they can garner the support of the Arabs. And I think, little by little, they will. Thank you.
Thank you. Khaled, you talked about getting back to a rules-based order, but I think, year after year of watching the United Nations try to grapple with these issues and then seeing the vetoes from the United States, seeing the bullying, seeing no consequences for Israeli action with the settlements. Can we say that the United Nations is pretty impotent at this point in resolving any of these issues? And at what point do we try to move towards another champion? Is there another champion out there that can sort of move the ball in the other direction? Or is it up to what Said is saying, is that it's going to come down to the Palestinians having to sort of get its house in order, relations of priorities and negotiations and all that?
I think there's no doubt that the international order was already in decline before Trump, and its ineffectiveness and deficiencies were already, we've seen them on display in many on many occasions, not least of all in places like Syria and other crises in the region, where Trump has been able to capitalize on the weakness of these institutions and the weakness of the international commitment to the international order. But this is an international order that was put in place post World War II, and it is a bit outdated. It needs kind of a software update and a reboot, if not considerably more. So that's one part of it. I do think that at this stage, I think Said is right. I think the Palestinians cannot rely. Well, first of all, let me say, I think the threat comes not from acceptance. No one will officially accept the plan. The threat doesn't come from acceptance. It comes from acquiescence, saying, we don't like the plan, but, we're not really going to push too hard on it. And we see that in the European countries and also a number of Arab states that took a very strong stand collectively in the Arab League in Cairo, but individually they're saying and doing very different things. And the Europeans are the same. No one wants to pick a fight with the Trump administration, and probably no one wants to fall on their sword with the Trump administration for the Palestinians, right? This is not, as Shibley said, this is not necessarily a strategic issue for, not just for the US, but for other powers. So really, it is a question for the Palestinians. I think history has shown two things. One, that when Palestinians don't have a credible, cohesive political leadership, that bad things tend to happen to them. We saw that in 1948, their political leadership was shattered by the British during the Mandate, exiled, imprisoned, and otherwise kind of rendered sort of obsolete. And then, of course, we had the Nakba in 1948. And we saw also in 1967 the limits of what Arab, quote unquote, solidarity can achieve. And it was only when Palestinians took matters into their own hands and created their own autonomous political national organizations that they were able to change their situation. And sadly, I think we're in a moment where the Palestinians are they don't have a truly representative leadership. There are many internal problems with their political institutions, and that is contributing. I think that is allowing the Israelis and the Americans to do what they're doing to a very large extent. So I do think that it falls on the Palestinians to fix their own house, whatever that means. I'm agnostic. I'm not a Palestinian. It's up to Palestinians to decide. Do we reform the PLO? Do we replace it? Is the PA still relevant? What role does it play? What is the relationship between these two institutions? Are they competitors or are they complementary? Because there are many contradictions there. But these are questions that I think before we can even entertain the idea of negotiations or something that we could call a peace process, that Palestinians have to resolve. Basically, they will have to, I think, put their political house in order before any of the other issues can be tackled.
I have just one question before we go to, and this is for.
Are you leaving us about 3 minutes for the rest of us?
Which one?
I'm sorry, we don't have much time, so I suggest.
Okay, let's go to, Q&A.
My hand's
Sir.
been up. Since Said somehow managed to insert my name into this, I'm a Saba part that talked about this is the best deal ever. I truly believe it is the best deal ever that is being thrown on the Palestinians, and I'm very proud Palestinian American. I think it is time for us to really say to everybody, go to hell, and we should begin immediately a passive resistance in all the towns and villages of the West Bank, in all the towns and villages of Israel. I come from the minority within the state of Israel of 1 point, we're about what, 1.8 now? 2 million now, okay. See, we're very fast producers. And then, let the world deal with human rights violations. That's the only way we're going to get anything done for the Palestinian cause, because all, this vote in the Arab League, I was watching it, and I almost broke the TV from anger. It was so embarrassing to see these, I'm not a political, theorist, I'm an activist. These bastards deserve no respect. They deserve to be said, go to hell, leave us alone, and we will deal with the Israelis, because the Israelis don't seem to understand the language that they promoted for us to communicate with them. They created in order for them to stifle our movement. That's it. So they can say these people are really bad and they're very kind of aggressive. You know what? We should be aggressive. Thank you.
Why don't you take the question?
Yeah. Thank you. I do have a question, so I'm not going to just go on with commentary, but I'd like to give a little context. And the question concerns whether this might be leading to overt ethnic cleansing as opposed to slow rolling, covert ethnic cleansing. If you recall, the Zionist foundation of the Zionist movement was a slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. And somehow that still seems to be abused by some. They can't see them. The Palestinians are invisible. Since 1947, if not much earlier, it's been the goal of many right-wingers, the Zionists, to get the maximum amount of land with the fewest number of Palestinians. And Benny Morris, a historian, finally broke the silence, got into the documentation in Israel of what went on in 47, 48, documented the deliberate ethnic cleansing that went on, although later came under a lot of pressure, and later he said the mistake was we didn't finish the job. We should have done Nazareth, we should have done the Galilee, etc. And even Perez, who many talk about as a man of peace, etc., who was one of the first to start supporting the settlers in this competition with Rabin and vice versa. And so my question is this: this plan, such as it is, seems to be designed to A, force a Palestinian rejection, and even, as you say, resistance or uprising, etc. And then what do you think is going to happen? Do you think the Israelis are going to be satisfied with 6.5 million Palestinians between the sea and the Jordan? Or do you think maybe they will use any uprising, any new intifada, any resistance to do what Shibley was talking about? Jordan is Palestine, to push a lot of Palestinians across the
Well, if I may, yeah, I mean, the Israelis will not, hesitate, not for a moment, to do despicable things, because they think they get away with it.
Well, they have done.
They have done it time and again, and I think that they do probably aspire and they dream about ethnically cleansing the West Bank and so on, and probably more. And I think, like Shibley said, they use this biblical argument to take the West Bank. I mean, if they want to give up on the biblical justification, which is the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, as they call it, then they feel justified being in Yafa and Haifa and these other places. So yes, but that should not prevent the Palestinians from resisting. The Palestinians today, there are more Palestinians between the river and the Mediterranean Sea than there are Jewish Israelis. So I think that that's your situation. You cannot just say, okay, that's fine, rule over me, and you live in this Swiss cheese thing, or let them do whatever they want, because they will not stop at that.
But you don't pay a price.
I'm saying, look, the Palestinians have been paying the price. There's not a single day in which a Palestinian is not killed or arrested, or the raid in my village, night after night in my village, they arrest people. They just killed a young 14-year-old just 3 weeks ago in my little town. So this happens all the time. Look what is happening in Gaza. So the thing is, if you really want to garner support, you cannot remain passive. You must resist this huge injustice. And I'm not going to label what kind of resistance there ought to be, but people are entitled to say no to repression and to oppression. And the world, like Sarah said, the world decides. I mean, if we tend to forget, by the way, it was 30 years ago when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. It was only 30 years ago. I mean, last week, I think, or something like this. So in the last days of the Reagan administration, they were saying all kinds of accolades about South Africa and their support and how strong it is and so on and all this. And now it is an expression of history. I'm saying that the Palestinians can continue to resist because that's their fate. They cannot escape that reality. They're not going to go anywhere. So they have to be creative, and the way they resist this occupation to effect results. I'm not saying go and take the Israelis, who are one of the most, have one of the most brutal and well-armed armies in the world. I'm saying they have to be creative and resistant.
Just if I may say, Ted, that question is a good question. Obviously, I think the chance has increased. I mean, part of it is that even though I think Israeli politics are fluid, I don't think everybody in Israel supports ethnic cleansing by any means. And, however, there are two things that have, moved in that direction. Within the Jewish population, there's been an increase in right wing, for sure, over the years. And obviously we've had right-wing governments that have been under the influence of the extreme right. So you can imagine all sorts of scenarios that could create an environment where that might be a possibility. But the worst part of it, in my own opinion, is that you have the United States, the main superpower in the world, the leader of the free world, putting its name on something that is transfer of towns and populations based on ethnicity. That is dangerous, because what it does, even if you don't get the majorities of people supporting it in Israel, it emboldens those who want to do it. And, just yesterday, there was a town in northern Israel, Jish, it's a Palestinian-Israeli town. You had, vandalism of 170 vehicles. And by the way, the majority of that town are Christian. And the mayor of the mayor of the town is Christian. So it's not about Christian or Muslim or Jewish. It's about, ethnicity. And that's, maybe it's completely unrelated to the flag, because we've seen those kind of attacks before, more on the West Bank, but increasingly we're seeing it in Arab villages within Israel itself. But I think this is the kind of plan that empowers, just like we have seen the Trump administration rhetoric empower extremes within our own society. It doesn't mean the majority of Americans are moving that way, but they get empowered and they create environments that, that increase the tension. And it's very dangerous. So yes, I do worry about it. This is one reason why I think this is an un-American plan. It's a particularly un-American plan, and it's really troubling.
Sir?
Okay, I agree with Khaled. Annexation is coming today, tomorrow, in 2 years, in 1 year, because, Bibi Netanyahu wanted to immediately annex after the plan was announced, and then Kushner said, no, wait until after the election. The question is that the day after, what the Palestinians and the Arabs should do the day after Bibi Netanyahu annexed 1/3 of the West Bank.
He addressed you first.
It's all your fault.
All right, what should they do? At that point, I think if we get formal annexation, of course, we have informal de facto annexation happening every day. But if formal annexation happens, I think at that point, Palestinians and the leadership in particular will have to decide whether the continued existence of the Palestinian Authority is a pathway to independence or a facilitator of what is in reality an apartheid situation on the ground. So I think there's already that dilemma exists now, but it becomes much clearer when it becomes much more stark when you have formal annexation by Israel and recognition by the United States, and probably acquiescence by most of the regions. And so at that point, I don't see how Palestinians the leadership would be able to continue to make the case that the two-state solution is the goal, because it would be, I think, the end. If it's not already, I think that would be the formal end.
Any more questions? Or do you?
Yeah, but I want to ask something
Okay.
really fast. In the plan, something was buried that wasn't noticed still. I think Haaretz noticed it about the transfer of 350,000 Israeli citizens, which is it's very insulting to include extreme right-wing demands from Israel into a U.S. plan. But I have a question for all three of you. What's the worst part of the plan in your opinion?
Well, as I said, I don't think you really can identify. By the way, I don't know when I mentioned that twice, and I alerted, that was the first thing I pulled out of the plan when I tweeted about it, at that time, because it was striking because of that, it's not, it goes beyond the historical.
I can push the
Yeah.
mission until, it's
But-
really pressed.
But regardless, I don't think there's anything, I mean, it's all bad, but I happen to think the worst part is the principles underpinning it. It's not just the details. Details are absolutely problematic, but it's just the principles underpinning it. That is that you start with the asymmetry of power as a starting point. This is reality. You ignore international resolutions and law, and you ignore past history, and you deal with power as it exists, and you organize a solution based on that asymmetry. I think that is by far the most troubling, because it has consequences beyond any details that you might come up with.
If you want to tackle the worst part of the plan?
The plan, just to reiterate the obvious, the whole plan is very bad. I mean, it's all one issue. And the issue is to allow Israel to continue to annex the land, take the land, and so on. That is really that's one goal. The rest is just a way to justify why is this part of a grander scheme. This is, I believe, has been around for a very long time. I'm not so sure that Mr. Kushner or Greenblatt, much less the president, really spent any time on this plan. It was probably given to them. And apparently there was an article yesterday in Foreign Policy that shows a 1979 plan, and probably have, there it is. It's the same exact thing that was offered before. So they didn't really have to work very hard on the plan. They spent 3 years basically in cutting and pasting the stuff to say there's a plan. So the whole plan ought to be rejected on the premise that it denies the Palestinians their humanity, denies them their right to live freely in their own land and to exercise sovereignty over their land.
I mean, I think I agree with Shibley. I think the most troubling aspect of the plan, or even using the word principles, seems inappropriate because they're not principles in the way we understand them. But the guiding framework, the underlying worldview, is deeply, deeply troubling. In 1946, a Republican by the name of Herbert Hoover, who was at that point a former U.S. president, had a brilliant idea that he promoted as a plan for peace and humanity, in the name of resolving the Palestine problem, which was at that point coming to a head. He had a great idea that he said was a great humanitarian gesture, which was to remove what was then the entire Arab population of Palestine, about 1 million human beings, and transfer them to Iraq or Jordan. And this was adopted by a wing of the Republican Party. And so the current situation, it's obviously ethnic cleansing is an illiberal concept. And this is 3 years before the Nakba, by the way, or 2 years before the Nakba. It's a fundamentally illiberal concept, but even Americans are capable of rationalizing very illiberal ideas. And that's what we have in this plan that justifies. And so this plan reminds me of that, where it justifies a hyper ethnocentric nationalist view of the world that is extremist. It is legitimizing views that used to be in the margins even of Israeli politics, and now for them to become mainstream in a U.S. plan, I think that's the most disturbing aspect of it.
I think we have time for one more.
Yeah,
Bruce,
one-
fine?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just one observation. I'm not sure all of this chorus is novel. Remember, Thucydides wrote in the Peloponnesian Wars, international relations, the strong do what they can, and weak suffer what they must. I worked a long time in Kashmir, and this reminds me very similar to what's happening there at present. When Modi unilaterally annexed Kashmir, the UN's had over 60 years Security Council resolutions calling for a plebiscite there. They have laws that enable the Indian Defense Forces to kill with impunity. And the world reacts the same way. Nothing happens. why wouldn't the Israelis, looking at what's happened in Kashmir, say, we can annex the West Bank, what's gonna happen? Everyone will just turn, they'll get tired of it. They say in Kashmir, it doesn't quite get the publicity as it has in the West Bank because Israel's not around and no one knows where India or Kashmir is or Pakistan. But the viciousness, the horrors there are every bit as cruel as they are in the West Bank.
Jerry.
Yes, thank you very much for this time. My region of expertise is Latin America, so I thank you for the learning experience. My question is there anyone in the ear of President Trump, like Jared Kushner, expressing this side and perspective of the story? And if not, why not?
Excuse me, I think I'm the only one who's gonna ask a question. This is probably gonna be to Professor Telhami. You have talked about how, what is the Democratic Party will win the administration coming election. Maybe they will change the plan, not accept the plan, but the fact that there is effects on the ground, like, for example, moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Since you are saying that maybe not accepting the plan, I was wondering on whom you are building your hope, if there is hope from the Democratic Party that may really do anything or changing anything, because since the sincere, the genuine Obama did nothing. I don't know on whom maybe we can really build our hope. I have one in mind, but I wonder if one of the others will.
Let me quickly address first the power politics. Of course, you know, I'm a realist from the International Relations School, and so in that sense, despite my liberalism as an individual, I understand the role of power. And powerful states have been able to get away with a lot throughout history. But there is a little difference, and I really would like to point that out. That's substantially important. Those of us who witness the current international system as it exists, the United Nations, international laws, we know it, norms, agreements between states, they were all, but realists accept them as part of realism, meaning what? Meaning that most powerful states, particularly superpowers, simply it's easier for them to manage the power by helping write the rules of the game. So the UN, of course, the big powers wrote the rules of the game. The 5 of them are permanent members of the Security Council. So most of the existing norms that regulate international relations, they're already biased toward the powerful states. And so in that sense, powerful states need them. And if you remove them, they don't know how to behave, and this leads to anarchy. So I think that, of course, the Israelis can get away with a lot, but the fact that the US puts its name on something like this is critical. And that's why you find the critique of Trump's foreign policy goes far beyond what he's doing vis-a-vis Israel. It is about this disregard for international institutions, previous agreements, all of which were written, taking into account the superior Israeli power as an instrument of self-service, because it's a long-term interest to have those institutions helping you rather than managing things unilaterally. It's obviously a debate, but it's very important. In terms of Democrats, I'm not going to mention names, but I want to say one thing. There has been a transformation in the Democratic politics. And it may not be that Democrats are going to find a solution that is going to be acceptable, or whether it's a 2-state or 1-state. But I can tell you one thing that is extremely important in America. When you ask people if there is no 2-state solution, and I think more people will conclude that, would you then support the Jewishness of Israel, meaning that Israel should remain Jewish even if it meant that non-Jews will not have full equality? Or would you support the democracy of Israel, which means you will want full equality for everyone, even if it meant that Israel ceases to be a Jewish state? And the strong majority, 2/3 of Americans, have consistently said, I support the democracy of Israel over Jewishness. And among Democrats, it's almost 87%. So I think the fact is that maybe a Democratic president may not have the ability to put together a foreign policy that will come up with particular alternatives, but there will not be an acceptance of a state of inequality, permanent inequality in Israel-Palestine. And you will hear that far more in a way that is consequential for policy, no matter which Democrat becomes president.
On your, Mr. Kushner's view, that was your question, Mike?
My question was,
Does anyone from the other side have?
operate in that capacity?
Yeah,
And if not,
obviously not, because all we have to do is take Netanyahu's word on this. He's always bragging that how when he used to come to the United States, he would stay at the Kushner's house. In fact, he would stay in Jared Kushner's room and so on. And so we know for a fact that Kushner, his father, were supporters and they were on the board of Beit El, a settlement, and so is David Friedman. So the answer to your question, no. I mean, they came in with a predetermined agenda. And they came, they thought this is the most propitious moment to basically have the Palestinian surrender. And not only surrender, but surrender in the most humiliating way, saying that we are not. So the short answer, no one did.
just one addition. I think we're looking at most likely another 4 years. I think it's in the best interest to start looking at that direction, to get someone, there's probably some people right here qualified to move into that type of position, to just present the other side physically. And I don't want to hear you say it cannot be done.
Jerry, I think you have good access to the White House and you sit on an advisory committee with President Trump. You should help us with that. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for being with us. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank Kelley for moderating this on short notice. And again, thank you. I'd like you to always join us. We have a monthly lunch here, and I think next will be about 3 hours. Thank you very much.
I don't know everything about it.